The Dakota Territory witnessed its share of remarkable love stories during the harsh frontier years following the Civil War. Tales of widowed settlers finding comfort in arranged marriages, desperate prospectors advertising for companionship, and Eastern women braving the untamed West for the promise of a new beginning. But perhaps none was more extraordinary than the journey of Clara, scarred angel Blackwood, a woman whose arrival as a mail-order bride became a legend that would inspire generations. Rejected for her appearance, yet possessing a spirit that could not be broken, she once softly declared, "Some judge beauty by what their eyes perceive, others see with their hearts and find treasures invisible to those blinded by shallow sight." Join me today as we delve into the story of the woman they called Scarred Angel, whose unlikely romance with a Lakota warrior named Thunderhawk proved that sometimes the most beautiful souls are housed in vessels the world is too quick to dismiss. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cedar Ridge, Dakota Territory, spring of 1871. The town was like many others, emerging across the frontier, a dusty main street lined with hastily constructed buildings where ambition and hardship coexisted beneath the shadow of the distant Black Hills. It was the kind of place where folks struggled against nature's cruelty and human indifference, which made the arrival of a mail-order bride an event worthy of gossip for weeks. She descended from the stagecoach on a crisp April morning, clutching a single weathered carpetbag, her face partially obscured by a blue bonnet pulled low. Those who witnessed her arrival would later recall two things: the noticeable burn scar that traced from her left temple down her cheek, and the almost ethereal grace with which she moved despite the obvious anxiety in her posture. The townsfolk of Cedar Ridge were no strangers to hardship, but something about Clara Blackwood's arrival seemed different. She carried herself with a dignity that contradicted her circumstances. A woman traveling alone to marry a man she had never met, in a land where female company was as precious as gold. Sheriff Thomas Reid, a veteran of both the Mexican and Civil Wars who'd witnessed humanity at its worst, observed the newcomer from the shade of his office porch. "There are two kinds of damaged souls in this territory," he'd later confide to his journal. "Those broken beyond repair and those forged stronger in the fire of their suffering. Miss Blackwood struck me as the latter." Martha Sullivan, the town's only midwife and healer, was the first to properly welcome the newcomer, offering to tend to a persistent cough Clara had developed during her long journey. In the privacy of Martha's modest clinic, she couldn't help but notice that the scarring extended beyond Clara's face, evidence of a terrible fire that had left its mark across her left shoulder and arm. "The flames took my former life," Clara explained quietly when she caught Martha's gaze, "but they gave me a second chance as well." There was no self-pity in her voice, only a calm acceptance that spoke volumes about her character. Martha was a woman who understood resilience, and the questions she didn't ask spoke as loudly as those she did. Within days, the purpose of Clara's journey became painfully clear. Walter Pembroke, a successful cattle rancher whose advertisement in Eastern newspapers had promised a comfortable home for a respectable Christian woman seeking matrimony, took one look at Clara's scarred features and publicly rejected her. "At the town's only restaurant. This isn't what I paid for," he declared, loud enough for all to hear. "I asked for a proper wife, not damaged goods." He tossed a few coins on the table. "That should cover your return journey. I suggest you take the next stage back east." The restaurant fell silent, every eye fixed on the humiliated woman. Clara neither wept nor argued. She simply placed her napkin beside her untouched plate, rose from her chair with remarkable composure, and walked out into the street, her head held high despite the burning shame that colored her unscarred cheek. Abigail, Cooper, whose general store served as the town's social hub, witnessed Clara entering the stagecoach office only to emerge moments later with a defeated expression. No eastbound stage for another 3 weeks. Abigail overheard her tell the clerk, "I understand, thank you anyway." With nowhere to go and limited funds, Clara found temporary lodging at the modest boarding house run by widow Lenora Hayes, a stern but fair woman who had survived 2 husbands and built a reputation for sheltering those in need, often in exchange for help with the endless chores her establishment generated. "The girl works harder than most men I've known," Lenora would later tell Rebecca West, the schoolteacher. "Never complains, even when the soap burns those scars of hers raw. There's more to her story than she's sharing, educated too by the way she speaks and writes. Ain't just some desperate factory girl looking for escape." Indeed, there were peculiar details about their new boarder that didn't escape notice. Clara possessed refined penmanship and was often seen writing in a leather-bound journal in the evenings. She spoke French fluently, as discovered when a Quebecois fur trader passed through town. She carried a silver locket containing a charred photograph, the image too damaged to discern. Yet, she would press it to her heart each night before sleep, as if drawing strength from its contents. But there were other oddities that generated whispers, the way she would wake screaming from nightmares that left her trembling until dawn, how she flinched at the crackling sound of the hearth fire, the fact that no one seemed to know anything about her life before the scarring, beyond vague references to Boston and a father who had been a man of letters. Sheriff Reid, whose natural curiosity was heightened by years in law enforcement, discreetly sent inquiries east about Miss Clara Blackwood of Boston. "Something doesn't add up," he confided to his deputy. "A woman with her education doesn't usually resort to becoming a mail-order bride unless she's running from something or someone." Clara's situation might have remained a source of idle speculation if not for the arrival of a Lakota warrior named Thunderhawk that summer. Unlike most Native Americans who approached Cedar Ridge with caution, Thunderhawk rode directly down the main street with the confidence of a man who feared no one's judgment. His mixed heritage was evident in his features, the son of a Lakota mother and a French-Canadian trapper father, as was his unusual position straddling 2 worlds. Thunder. Hawk served as an interpreter and scout for the army at Fort Peterson, earning both respect and suspicion from whites and Lakota alike. His reputation as a fiercely honorable man who walked his own path preceded him, as did rumors of his education at a Pennsylvania mission school before returning to his mother's people. The first encounter between Clara and Thunderhawk occurred outside Abigail's store on a sweltering July afternoon. Clara had been struggling with a heavy sack of flour when the warrior dismounted in one fluid motion and lifted the burden from her arms. "Sometimes the strongest shoulders are not meant to carry weight alone," he said in perfect English, his dark eyes meeting hers without flinching from her scars. The brief exchange drew stares from passers-by, unaccustomed to seeing a civilized white woman conversing with a Native American regardless of his reputation. But those close enough noticed something remarkable. For the first time since her arrival, Clara's face brightened with a genuine smile that transformed her features, momentarily revealing the beauty that lay beneath the scars. "Thank you," she replied, her voice stronger than the whisper most townsfolk had grown accustomed to hearing. "I'm Clara Blackwood. I am called Thunderhawk among your people," he answered with a slight nod. "Among my own I have another name, one earned rather than given." There was a quiet dignity in his manner that seemed to mirror Clara's own. The interaction might have remained unremarkable, if not for what followed. Over the next few days, Thunderhawk's business in Cedar Ridge, ostensibly delivering messages from the fort, seemed to require multiple visits, each one somehow intersecting with Clara's daily routines. To the shock of many, Clara did not rebuff these encounters. Instead, those with sharp eyes noted the gradual transformation in her demeanor, her posture straightening, her voice growing stronger, her scarred face emerging from the shadow of her bonnet as if she was slowly shedding a protective shell. Walter Pembroke, still smarting from public criticism over his callous rejection of Clara, watched these developments with mounting displeasure. "Bad enough to bring Eastern trash to our town," he complained loudly at the saloon. "Now she's consorting with savages. Someone ought to remind her of her place." The mounting tension might have remained mere undercurrents if not for the arrival of Franklin Wallace, a Boston attorney whose appearance at the sheriff's office caused immediate speculation. His fine Eastern clothes and clipped accent marked him as distinctly out of place in Cedar Ridge. "I'm seeking information about a young woman," he informed Sheriff Reid, presenting a daguerreotype of a beautiful young woman with no scarring, yet whose eyes unmistakably belonged to Clara Blackwood. Miss Charlotte Blackwood Hayes, daughter of Professor Edmund Blackwood Hayes of Harvard University. She disappeared following a tragic fire that claimed her family home and her father's life approximately 14 months ago. The revelation sent shockwaves through the sheriff's office. "That's Clara Blackwood," Deputy Wilson exclaimed, recognizing the eyes despite the unmarred features in the image. "But why would she change her name and travel here as a mail-order bride?" Franklin Wallace's face grew grave as he lowered his voice. "Because, young man, Miss Blackwood Hayes is the sole witness to what investigators now believe was not an accident, but arson and murder. Her father was developing a legal case against several prominent Boston businessmen involved in land speculation that displaced numerous immigrant families. Before the evidence could be presented, the fire conveniently destroyed both the professor and his documents. As Wallace continued his explanation, the pieces began falling into place for Sheriff Reid. "She's hiding," he concluded, "using a mail-order arrangement to disappear into the territory where no one would think to look for a Harvard professor's daughter." "Precisely," Wallace confirmed, "and we have reason to believe the men responsible have discovered her location. I'm here not to expose her, but to warn her. Her testimony could still bring these men to justice, but first she must survive long enough to provide it." Outside the sheriff's office, Cedar Ridge continued its daily rhythms, unaware of the gathering storm. At the boarding house, Clara was teaching Widow Hayes's young grandson to read using a tattered copy of The Last of the Mohicans. Thunderhawk, observing from the doorway, listened to her patient explanations with an expression of quiet admiration. "You have the soul of a teacher," he commented when the lesson concluded. Clara's fingers unconsciously touched the scarring on her cheek. "In another life, perhaps. Now I'm just a woman of great courage," he interrupted, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "My people believe scars are sacred markings. They tell the story of our survival, not our defeat." For a moment, Clara seemed about to share something profound, her guard lowering in his presence as it did with no one else. But the moment shattered as Walter Pembroke appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with anger and whiskey. "Well, isn't this touching?" he sneered, swaying slightly as he braced himself against the doorframe. "The disfigured reject and the half-breed savage. Perfect match, I'd say." Thunderhawk's expression remained impassive, though those who knew him would have recognized the dangerous stillness that came over him, like the calm before a prairie thunderstorm. "Your words dishonor only yourself," he stated evenly. Pembroke's hand drifted toward the pistol on his hip. "You speaking to me, Indian? Because civilized men don't take correction from—" "That's quite enough, Walter." Sheriff Reid's voice cut through the tension as he appeared behind Pembroke. "I believe you've had enough to drink for one day. Time to head home." The rancher hesitated, clearly contemplating defiance, but something in the sheriff's stance suggested this was not a battle worth fighting, at least not now. With a final venomous glance at Clara and Thunderhawk, he allowed himself to be led away, muttering threats that the wind carried back in fragments. In the sudden quiet following their departure, Clara's composure finally cracked. Her hands trembled, visibly as she gathered her teaching materials. "I should never have come here," she whispered, more to herself than to Thunderhawk. "I've brought nothing but trouble." The Lakota warrior studied her with eyes that seemed to see beyond her scars, beyond even the beauty that had once been hers. "The eagle does not regret leaving the nest," he said quietly, "even when the winds become storms." What neither realized in that moment was that far greater storms were gathering on the horizon. In a hotel room in nearby Fort Pierre, 3 men from Boston were reviewing a hand-drawn map of Cedar Ridge, their expressions cold with purpose. On the table between them lay a wanted poster offering a substantial reward for information leading to Charlotte Blackwood Hayes, dead or alive. The piece that Clara had found in this remote corner of the Dakota Territory was balanced on a knife's edge, about to be shattered by echoes from her past. And as the summer sun set over the distant Black Hills, casting long shadows across the town, Thunderhawk sensed the shift in the winds that carried whispers of approaching danger. In the sheriff's office, Reid carefully locked away Franklin Wallace's documents in his safe, his weathered face grave with concern. "We need to warn her," Wallace insisted, "before it's too late." Reid nodded slowly, his years of experience telling him that the peaceful routine of Cedar Ridge was about to be broken by violence that had traveled all the way from Boston's polished streets to the rugged frontier. What no one yet realized was that the coming conflict would reveal not just Clara's hidden past, but Thunderhawk's own closely guarded secrets, and forge a bond between them that would become the stuff of Dakota Territory legend. The air grew, thick with tension, as Sheriff Reid and Franklin Wallace made their way toward the Hayes boarding house in the gathering twilight. Cedar Ridge settled into its evening routine, lamps flickering to life in windows, the saloon growing louder with each passing hour, ranch hands and shopkeepers returning to their homes after a long day's work. None suspected that beneath this ordinary scene, currents of danger were swirling ever closer to their quiet town. Inside the boarding house, Clara was helping Widow Hayes prepare the evening meal, her nimble fingers working methodically as she peeled potatoes with practiced efficiency. The domestic tranquility of the scene contrasted sharply with the anxious thoughts that had plagued her since Pembroke's confrontation hours earlier. "That Indian been coming around too often," Widow Hayes remarked, her tone neutral, but her eyes watchful as she kneaded dough for biscuits. "Folk are starting to talk." Clara kept her gaze fixed on her task. "Mr. Thunderhawk has shown me kindness when others offered only cruelty. I see no reason to refuse his friendship." The older woman sighed, flour dusting her forearms like fresh snow. "Friendship is one thing, girl. Whatever's growing between you two is something else entirely. I don't judge. Lost too much in my life to waste energy on such foolishness, but others won't be so charitable." Before Clara could respond, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Widow Hayes wiped her hands on her apron and moved to answer it, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern as she recognized the sheriff and a well-dressed stranger on her threshold. "Evening, Lenora," Sheriff Reid said, removing his hat. "Need a word with Miss Blackwood, if she's available." Clara appeared in the doorway behind the widow, a dish towel still clutched in her scarred hands. Something in the sheriff's somber expression told her that her carefully constructed new life was about to collapse. "Miss Blackwood," Franklin Wallace began, then corrected himself. "Or perhaps I should say, Miss Blackwood Hayes. I'm Franklin Wallace, your father's attorney." He extended his hand, which Clara regarded with the wariness of a cornered animal. "I believe you're mistaken, sir," she replied, her voice barely audible. "My father was a merchant from Boston who died of consumption 3 years ago." Wallace's expression softened with understanding. "Your caution is commendable, but unnecessary with me. I've come not to expose you, but to warn you, the men responsible for the fire. They know you're here." The color drained from Clara's face, her fingers unconsciously rising to touch the scarred tissue along her cheek. For a moment, she seemed about to deny everything, but instead her shoulders sagged with the weight of a burden too long carried alone. "Perhaps we should speak privately," she conceded, gesturing toward the small parlor adjacent to the kitchen. Once seated, with Sheriff Reid standing guard near the window and Widow Hayes discreetly withdrawing to give them privacy, Clara finally allowed the carefully maintained facade of Clara Blackwood to fall away. "How did they find me?" she asked, her voice stronger now, educated tones replacing the deliberate simplicity she'd adopted for months. "Your father's research notes weren't completely destroyed," Wallace explained. "A partial ledger survived in his office at the university. It contained a list of potential safe havens, friends and colleagues scattered across the country who might shelter you if something happened to him." "But I didn't go to any of those places," Clara objected. "I specifically avoided them." "Which was wise," Wallace agreed. "But Harrison Blackwell's men are thorough. When none of those leads panned out, they began monitoring mail-order bride advertisements. Your father had mentioned the strategy once in passing, how historically women had used such arrangements to disappear from difficult situations." Sheriff Reid, who had been silently absorbing this exchange, finally spoke. "These men, what exactly are we dealing with?" Wallace's expression darkened. "Harrison Blackwell heads one of Boston's most powerful investment syndicates. On the surface, a respected businessman and philanthropist, beneath a man who systematically bought or destroyed anyone standing between him and profit. The fire that killed Professor Blackwood Hayes and scarred his daughter was meant to eliminate both the evidence of illegal land seizures and the man compiling it. But they didn't account for me surviving," Clara added quietly. "Or that my father had shared enough with me that my testimony alone could still damage them." "Exactly," Wallace confirmed, "which is why they won't simply try to discredit you now. They'll want to ensure your permanent silence." The gravity of the situation settled over the room like a physical weight. Sheriff Reid adjusted the revolver at his hip, his weathered face set with determination. "How many men and when?" "3 that we know of," Wallace replied. "Led by Sebastian Rook, Blackwell's problem solver, a former Pinkerton who now employs his considerable skills for less honorable purposes. They were in Fort Pierre 2 days ago, which means they could be here already," Reid finished grimly. Clara's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "What do you propose, Sheriff?" "I won't run again. I've been running for 14 months. Before Reid could answer, the distant sound of hoofbeats drew his attention to the window. Through the growing darkness, he could make out a lone rider approaching. At a gallop, the distinctive silhouette of Thunderhawk astride his painted stallion. "Seems we're about to have company," the sheriff observed, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. The Lakota warrior dismounted with fluid grace, securing his horse before taking the boarding house steps 2 at a time. His knock was urgent, his normally impassive face taut with tension when Widow Hayes opened the door. "I need to speak with Miss Blackwood," he stated, his sharp eyes registering the presence of Sheriff Reid and the stranger in Eastern clothes. "Immediately." Clara rose from her chair, crossing to the doorway with a swiftness that surprised the others. "What is it?" she asked, her concern evident. "Strangers asking questions at the fort," Thunderhawk replied, his voice low and urgent. "3 men from the east, showing a photograph. Your photograph, though without..." He gestured briefly toward her scarred cheek. Franklin Wallace exchanged a grim look with Sheriff Reid. "Rook moves faster than anticipated. They offered gold for information," Thunderhawk continued. "One of the soldiers recognized you from his time stationed in Boston. His uncle worked as groundskeeper at the university." Clara's composure finally cracked, her scarred hand reaching instinctively for Thunderhawk's arm. "Did he—" "He told them nothing," the warrior interrupted. "He came to me instead, knowing of our friendship." Something in the way he hesitated over the final word suggested deeper currents beneath the simple statement. Sheriff Reid moved toward the door with sudden decision. "We need to move you somewhere secure, Miss Blackwood Hayes. These men won't wait long once they have confirmation you're here. She can come to the fort," Thunderhawk suggested. "Colonel Harrington respects the law. He would grant her protection." Wallace shook his head. "If they've already been asking questions there, it's the first place they'll look." "My ranch," Reid offered. "It's isolated, defensible, and few know of its connection to me. I purchased it through a mining company I invested in years ago." As they debated options, Clara stood straighter, a new resolve hardening her features. "No," she stated firmly, silencing the men. "I won't be hidden away while others risk themselves on my behalf. Not again." Her hand unconsciously moved to the locket at her throat. "That's how my father died, sending me away to safety while he remained to face the consequences alone." Thunderhawk studied her with an intensity that seemed to peer into her very soul. "The wounded deer that keeps running eventually falls to exhaustion," he observed quietly. "Sometimes the herd must stand together against the wolves." Something in his words resonated deeply with Clara, bringing a flush of color to her pale cheeks. "Exactly," she agreed. "It's time I stopped running and started fighting back." Sheriff Reid looked skeptical. "Admirable sentiment, Miss Blackwood Hayes, but these men are professional killers. This isn't Boston with its courts and journalists. Out here, justice often comes from the barrel of a gun." A strange smile crossed Clara's face, transforming her features in a way that momentarily shocked those present. "You assume, because I'm a professor's daughter, that I'm helpless, Sheriff." She moved to her small traveling case in the corner of the room, unlocking it with a key kept around her neck alongside her locket. From within, she withdrew a Derringer pistol, small enough to fit in a lady's palm but lethal at close range. "My father believed in education of all kinds," she explained, checking the weapon with practiced ease, "including how to defend oneself in a world that often preys upon women." The revelation added yet another layer to the enigma of Clara Blackwood Hayes. Sheriff Reid reassessed the young woman with newfound respect, though his practical concerns remained. "A Derringer is fine for personal protection," he acknowledged, "but against 3 experienced gunmen, she won't face them alone." Hawk interjected, his hand moving to the bone-handled knife at his belt. The gesture carried unmistakable meaning. He had already decided his place in the coming conflict. Widow Hayes, who had been silently observing from the kitchen doorway, finally joined the conversation. "If you're fixing to make a stand, might as well do it properly." She moved to a cedar chest in the corner of the parlor, retrieving a key from around her own neck. "My second husband left me more than just this boarding house." From within the chest, she withdrew a Winchester rifle. Its stock worn smooth with age, but its mechanism clearly well maintained. "Jebediah believed a woman alone needed more than just prayer for protection," she explained, passing the weapon to Sheriff Reid for inspection. "Still hits true at 100 yards. The sheriff checked the action, nodding with approval. "You're full of surprises, Lenora." "Lived too long in this territory not to be," she replied simply. Franklin Wallace observed this scene with a mixture of concern and admiration. "I came to warn you, Miss Blackwood Hayes, not to bring war to this town," he said quietly. "But it seems the frontier has changed you more than I anticipated." Clara's scarred face held a strength that transcended physical beauty. The fire changed me, Mr. Wallace. The frontier merely gave me space to discover who I could become from the ashes. Their makeshift council of war continued as night fully descended upon Cedar Ridge. Maps were spread across Widow Hayes's dining. A table, strategies discussed and discarded as each person contributed their knowledge and skills to the emerging plan. Thunderhawk proved invaluable, his experience as an army scout giving him intimate knowledge of the surrounding terrain. "There are 3 main approaches to town," he explained, tracing routes with his finger. "From the east along the stage road, from the north following the creek bed, or from the west past the old mining claims. They'll want to maintain the element of surprise," Reid mused. "My guess is they'll come in separately, establish positions, and coordinate their move." Clara studied the crude map with the analytical mind that had made her father's daughter in more than just name. "If we know they're coming, perhaps we can use that to our advantage," she suggested. "Set a trap rather than simply waiting for their attack." Thunderhawk nodded slowly, a gleam of approval in his dark eyes. "The hunter becomes the hunted. My people have used such tactics against superior forces for generations." As they refined their strategy, a new complication arose with a pounding at the boarding house door. Deputy Wilson burst in, his young face flushed with exertion. "Sheriff, there's trouble at the saloon. Walter Pembroke's drunk and making threats. Says he knows about Miss Blackwood being some kind of fugitive. He's riling up some of the other ranchers." Reid cursed under his breath. "How in blazes did he—" "The strangers," Thunderhawk concluded grimly. "They've already arrived and are gathering allies." The sheriff buckled on his gun belt with practiced efficiency. "I need to handle this before it spirals further. Wilson, you stay here with Miss Blackwood Hayes and Mr. Wallace. Thunderhawk—" "I will scout the town perimeter," the Lakota warrior volunteered. "If Rook and his men are already here, they will have left signs for those who know how to read them." Clara watched this flurry of activity with growing distress. "This is exactly what I feared. Others endangered because of me." Widow Hayes placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Don't you start that nonsense, girl. Trouble finds Cedar Ridge regular as seasons change. You're just the latest excuse, not the cause." As the men prepared to depart on their respective missions, Thunderhawk paused beside Clara. For a moment they stood in silence, an unspoken current passing between them that needed no words. "When I return," he said finally, his voice pitched for her ears alone, "there is much we must discuss. About your past, yes, but also about possibilities for the future." Something in his tone sent warmth spreading through Clara's chest, despite the danger surrounding them. "Be careful," she whispered, surprising herself by reaching out to briefly touch his hand. The Lakota warrior's stoic expression softened momentarily. "Always," he promised, before disappearing into the night. At the saloon, Sheriff Reid found a volatile situation brewing. Walter Pembroke stood atop a table, gesticulating wildly as he addressed a growing crowd of increasingly agitated men. "Been harboring a criminal right under our noses," he proclaimed, whiskey slurring his words, but not diminishing their inflammatory effect. "That scarred woman ain't no mail-order bride. She's a fugitive with a price on her head. Got it straight." From some gentleman just arrived from Boston, Reid pushed through the crowd, his authority momentarily quieting the tumult. "That's enough, Walter. You're drunk and spreading dangerous lies." Pembroke's face twisted with malice. "Lies, is it? Then explain these, Sheriff." He thrust a handful of papers toward the lawman. Wanted posters offering $5,000 for information leading to Charlotte Blackwood Hayes, described as a dangerous agitator, wanted for arson, theft of corporate documents, and conspiracy. Reid scanned the posters, immediately recognizing them as sophisticated forgeries, but convincing ones to those without knowledge of the true situation. The crowd pressed closer, murmurs of shock and anger rippling through the gathered men. $5,000, someone whispered. That's more than most of us see in 3 years. She's been living among us, pretending to be something she ain't. Another added. Reid raised his hands for silence. These claims are being investigated, he announced firmly. Until then, anyone taking action based on these posters will answer to me. This is still a town of law. Law, Pembroke scoffed. Or are you just sweet on the scarred little liar yourself, Sheriff? Maybe you and that Indian both? Reid's patience evaporated. With two dawn was still hours away when Thunderhawk returned. To the boarding house, moving like a shadow through the darkness. The faint glow of a single lamp guided him to the back door where Clara sat waiting, her scarred face illuminated in the amber light. She hadn't slept. The tension etched across her features told him as much. But neither had fear overcome her. Resolve. They've established a perimeter around the town, he reported in hushed tones as she ushered him inside. Professional work. One man watching the stage road, another positioned behind the church with a clear view of this boarding house, the third, their leader, operating from the hotel. Clara absorbed this information with remarkable composure, her fingers tracing unconscious patterns on the worn tablecloth, and Sheriff Reid, still at his office with Pembroke locked in the cell. The crowd has dispersed for now, but morning will bring fresh trouble. Deputy Wilson emerged from the parlor where he'd been keeping watch, his young face drawn with fatigue. Any sign they plan to move tonight? Thunderhawk shook his head. They are patient hunters. They'll wait for daylight when they can better. Control the situation and have the support of any townsfolk swayed by their lies and money. Franklin Wallace joined them from the adjoining room where he'd been reviewing documents spread across Widow Hayes's writing desk. Then we still have time to implement our plan. The plan had emerged from hours of deliberation, a delicate balance of legal strategy and frontier pragmatism. Rather than hiding Clara away, they would bring Charlotte Blackwood Hayes fully into the light, using Wallace's documentation to expose Blackwell's schemes while simultaneously laying a trap for Rook and his hired guns. I've written out your full testimony, Wallace explained, presenting Clara with several neatly penned pages. Once signed and witnessed by Sheriff Reid, these become legal documents that can be dispatched to the territorial governor and federal marshals, regardless of what happens tomorrow. Clara reviewed the pages, nodding slowly. You've captured everything correctly. The land seizures, the intimidation of immigrant families, my father's evidence that linked Blackwell's company to the 3 judges who approved the evictions. Her scarred fingers tightened around the papers. But will justice come quickly enough to matter? Justice rarely travels as fast as greed or malice, Thunderhawk observed, the wisdom in his words belying his relatively young age. But it arrives with greater force when it does come. Widow Hayes, who had been silently preparing coffee for the group, finally spoke. All this legal business is well and good, but those men out there won't be stopped by papers and promises of future arrests. Deputy Wilson shifted uncomfortably. She's right. When Rook discovers we're formalizing testimony, he'll move immediately to silence Miss Blackwood Hayes. Which is precisely what we're counting on, Clara replied, a new edge to her voice that startled those who had initially perceived her as merely a refined victim of circumstance. When a predator believes its prey is cornered, it grows careless in its approach. Thunderhawk's eyes met hers with quiet approval. You've learned much from your time in the wilderness. I've had excellent teachers, she responded, holding his gaze a moment longer than necessary. The intimate exchange wasn't lost on the others present, but more urgent matters demanded their attention. Franklin Wallace spread a crude map of Cedar Ridge across the table, weighing down its corners with coffee cups. At first light, I'll take these documents to Sheriff Reid for official witnessing, he explained, tracing the route with his finger. That movement will almost certainly be observed and reported to Rook. Meanwhile, I'll escort Miss Blackwood Hayes to the telegraph office." Deputy Wilson continued, indicating another path through town, publicly announcing our intention to wire the territorial governor about a legal matter of urgent importance, creating 2 potential targets. Thunder. Hawk nodded approvingly. Forcing them to divide their attention and resources, Clara studied the map intently, and while their focus is split between the sheriff's office and the telegraph office, "I'll be tracking their movements," the Lakota warrior finished, identifying each man's position for Sheriff Reid. The plan hinged on careful timing and the assumption that Rook, despite his professional background, would react predictably when his quarry appeared to be slipping away. It was a calculated risk, but as Widow Hayes bluntly observed while refilling coffee cups, "Ain't a soul at this table hasn't been gambling with worse odds since the day they were born in this territory." As night deepened toward its darkest hours, final preparations were made. Clara retired briefly to her room, emerging in a simple but elegant dress that more accurately reflected her Boston upbringing, a conscious decision to embrace her true identity rather than hiding behind the humble disguise she'd maintained for months. "If I am to stand as Charlotte Blackwood Hayes," she explained to Widow Hayes's questioning look, "then I should look the part." The older woman's weathered face softened with understanding. "Your father would be proud, girl." Clara's fingers rose, unconsciously to touch the scarred tissue along her cheek. "I used to think these marks were a punishment, that surviving when he died was my burden to bear. But now I see they were a gift. They allowed me to disappear when I needed to hide, and they taught me that true worth lies beneath all surfaces." Thunder. Hawk, overhearing this from the doorway, spoke quietly. "Among my people, warriors earn their scars in battles worth fighting. Yours are no different." Their eyes met across the room, and something passed between them that transcended words. A recognition of kindred spirits forged in different fires, but emerging with the same tempered strength. Dawn was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky when Sheriff Reid arrived at the boarding house, his face grave but determined. "Pembroke's still locked up, but 2 of his ranch hands have been asking pointed questions around town, and there's been movement at the hotel. One of our visitors departed about an hour ago, riding north." "Seeking reinforcements?" Franklin. Wallace suggested with concern. "More likely establishing an escape route," Thunderhawk countered. "These men won't expect significant resistance." Reid nodded in agreement. "They're used to intimidating ordinary citizens, not facing organized opposition. That's our advantage." He turned to Clara, his expression softening slightly as he registered her transformation. "Miss Blackwood Hayes, are you certain about this course? It's not too late to move you somewhere secure." Clara squared her shoulders. The early morning light catching the scar tissue along her face, but somehow enhancing rather than diminishing her natural dignity. "I've been hiding in secure places for 14 months, Sheriff. It hasn't brought my father justice or me peace. Today, we end this, one way or another." The sheriff studied her for a moment longer, then nodded with newfound respect. "Your father raised a daughter with considerable courage, ma'am." "He raised me to believe that truth ultimately prevails," she corrected gently. "Courage is merely the vehicle that carries it forward." As the group made final preparations, Thunderhawk drew Clara aside, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "There is something you should know before events unfold. If circumstances become dire—" She waited, as he seemed to search for words, unusual for a man typically so precise in his speech. "My father's people had a ritual for those facing mortal danger together," he finally continued, "a binding that transcended death itself. My mother once told me that when she and my father were surrounded by enemies during a blizzard, believing they would not survive until morning, they exchanged such vows." Clara's breath caught as she grasped his meaning. You're speaking of marriage. Among my people, it is more than what your churches sanction, he explained, his dark eyes intense. It is a binding of spirits that even death cannot sever. I do. Not presume... Yes, she interrupted softly, her scarred hand rising to touch his arm. If circumstances become dire, I would welcome such a binding. A gentle smile transformed her features. Though I prefer we both survive to honor it properly. Something profound passed between them in that moment, a commitment beyond the conventional boundaries that separated their worlds. Thunderhawk nodded once, the gesture containing a depth of meaning that required no elaboration. The sun had fully crested the horizon when their plan was set into motion. Franklin Wallace departed first, the leather portfolio containing Clara's testimony tucked securely beneath his arm as he made his way toward the sheriff's office. Deputy Wilson escorted Clara out the front door of the boarding house 20 minutes later, her head held high despite the stares of early-rising townsfolk who had heard rumors of her true identity. Thunderhawk observed from the shadows between buildings, his experienced eyes quickly identifying the watchers. One man loitered near the general store, attempting to appear casual while maintaining clear sightlines to both the sheriff's office and the route to the telegraph office. Another positioned himself on the hotel's balcony, the morning sun occasionally glinting off what Thunderhawk recognized as a spyglass. The third man, Sebastian Rook himself, based on Wallace's description, was nowhere visible, which concerned the Lakota scout far more than the two he could see. Experienced hunters often concealed themselves in plain sight rather than obvious hiding places. The town was coming alive with morning activity, complicating surveillance as ranch hands, shopkeepers, and housewives began their daily routines. Some paused to openly stare at Clara, whispering behind hands as recognition dawned. The scarred mail-order bride now walked differently, her Boston bearing evident in every step despite the disfigurement that had previously dominated their perception of her. When Clara and Deputy Wilson reached the telegraph office, a small crowd had already gathered, drawn by curiosity and the previous night's rumors. Wilson positioned himself protectively beside her as she dictated a message to the territorial governor, loudly enough that several bystanders could clearly hear her identifying herself as Charlotte Blackwood Hayes and requesting immediate federal intervention regarding Harrison Blackwell's criminal enterprises. Across town, Wallace had reached the sheriff's office, where Reid formally witnessed Clara's written testimony. The documents were duplicated, one set secured in the sheriff's safe, while another was prepared for dispatch on the eastbound stage scheduled to depart that afternoon. Thunderhawk, moving with practiced stealth between vantage points, caught sight of the first direct response to these developments. The man near the general store had abandoned his post, slipping behind the buildings toward the hotel. Clearly, a new strategy was being formulated in response to their public legal maneuvers. What he couldn't see, what none of them had anticipated, was the fourth man who had arrived overnight, positioned in the hayloft of the livery stable with a clear view of both the telegraph office and the main street. This hidden observer tracked Clara's movements through the precision sights of a sharp's rifle. Clara emerged from the telegraph office into the strengthening morning sunlight, Deputy Wilson close beside her. The crowd parted before them, some faces hostile, others merely curious, a few, particularly among the town's women, showing unmistakable sympathy. Miss Blackwood Hayes. The call came from across the street, where Walter Pembroke's foreman, a hard-faced man named Tucker, stood with several ranch hands. That reward poster says you're wanted dead or alive. How much of that 5,000 you reckon we'd get for? Just shooting you where you stand. Deputy Wilson stepped forward, his hand moving to his gun. That's enough, Tucker. These posters are forgeries, and you're bordering on threatening a witness under protection of the law. Tucker spat contemptuously. Law? Out here? We make our own judgments about fancy Eastern criminals bringing their troubles to our town." The confrontation was drawing additional attention, exactly as Sebastian Rook had planned when he'd arranged Pembroke's escape from the jail not 30 minutes earlier. From his concealed position in a side alley, Rook observed with cold satisfaction as the predictable frontier justice mentality provided the perfect distraction. Clara, sensing the escalating danger, placed a restraining hand on Wilson's arm. "These men have been deceived, Deputy. They don't realize they're being manipulated by the very criminals who would exploit this territory, just as they've exploited immigrant communities in Boston." Her educated speech and calm demeanor temporarily unsettled the hostile crowd. She seized the moment, addressing them directly with the passionate conviction that had made her father a formidable advocate for the vulnerable. "Mr. Blackwell's company has already purchased options on water rights throughout the Dakota Territory," she revealed, her voice carrying clearly across the tense gathering. "The same strategy he employed in Massachusetts before forcing small ranchers and farmers to sell at pennies on the dollar or watch their livestock die of thirst." This calculated disclosure, one of many facts she had learned from her father's investigations, struck directly at the frontier community's greatest fears. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as even Tucker and his men exchanged uncertain glances. From his position, monitoring the shifting dynamics, Thunderhawk spotted movement at the hotel, a brief exchange between the balcony watcher and someone inside that triggered warning instincts honed through years of battlefield scouting. They were adjusting their strategy, recognizing that the crowd's mood was shifting against them. What happened next unfolded with the terrible clarity of a nightmare. Walter Pembroke, his face still bearing marks from his night in jail, emerged from between buildings directly across from Clara. His expression twisted with drunken rage and humiliation. He raised a revolver with unsteady hands. "Lying Eastern witch!" he screamed, the words slurred but his intent unmistakable. Deputy Wilson reached for his weapon, but Tucker and his men moved simultaneously. Whether to join Pembroke's attack or restrain him remained momentarily unclear. In that critical instant of confusion, Sebastian Rook found his perfect opportunity. Slipping through the crowd with practiced ease, he positioned himself within striking distance of Clara, a slim blade concealed in his palm. The professional. Assas, the Dakota plains stretched endlessly beneath a vast blue sky, the late summer grass rippling like a golden sea in the afternoon breeze. Sheriff Reid and Thunderhawk rode steadily northward, following tracks that would have been invisible to most men, but which the Lakota scout read as clearly as printed words on a page. "He's pushing his horse hard," Thunderhawk observed, leaning from his saddle to examine a set of hoofprints. "Too hard for this terrain. He'll either have to rest the animal soon or risk it going lame." Reid nodded grimly, adjusting his hat against the harsh sun. "How far ahead would you estimate?" 3 hours, perhaps less. He's following the old military trail toward Fort Chamberlain, likely hoping to lose himself among the soldiers and traders there. The sheriff's weathered face tightened with determination. "Then we push harder. I want this finished before sundown." As they rode, Thunderhawk's thoughts repeatedly returned to Cedar Ridge and the woman he'd left behind. Clara's wounded face had been etched with pain, but also fierce resolve as Dr. Matthews tended her injury. The memory of her blood spreading across that fine dress haunted him, fueling a cold rage that he contained beneath his customary stoic exterior. For his part, Sheriff Reid observed his companion with newfound respect. He had known Thunderhawk professionally for nearly 2 years, relying occasionally on his tracking skills, but had maintained the careful distance typical between white lawmen and Native Americans in the territory. Now, riding side by side in pursuit of a common enemy, he found himself reassessing the man. "You care for her," Reid stated after several miles of silence, not a question but an acknowledgement. Thunderhawk's expression remained impassive, his eyes continuously scanning the horizon. Among my people, a warrior does not speak of such matters lightly. Among mine, a man doesn't risk his life for a woman unless his heart's involved, Reid countered with the bluntness of the frontier. I've seen how you look at her, how she looks at you. For several moments, the only sound was the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on packed earth. Then Thunderhawk spoke, his voice low but resolute. My father was French-Canadian, my mother Lakota. Their union brought them both joy and suffering. The world does not make such paths easy to walk. Reid considered this. The territory's changing. Slow, mind you, but changing nonetheless. Not quickly enough, Thunderhawk replied, a rare bitterness entering his tone. Not for many who might wish to forge their own trail between worlds. Before Reid could respond, Thunderhawk raised his hand in warning, bringing both horses to a halt. Ahead, the trail descended into a shallow ravine where cottonwoods clustered along a seasonal creek bed, now mostly dry, except for scattered pools of stagnant water. He stopped there, the Lakota scout whispered, indicating the trees. Recently, the horse needed water. Reid unholstered his revolver with practiced ease. Could be an ambush position. Thunderhawk nodded once, his eyes narrowing as he studied the terrain. There, he pointed to a subtle disturbance in the grass along the ravine's edge. He left his horse in the trees and moved to higher ground. A sniper's instinct. The two men dismounted, securing their horses behind a small rise, and began a careful approach, Reid following Thunderhawk's lead as they used natural contours of the land for cover. They moved in silence born of shared purpose, communication reduced to hand signals and meaningful glances. When they reached the position Thunderhawk had identified, they found clear evidence, crushed grass where someone had lain prone, a discarded cigarette bearing a distinctive European maker's mark, and brass cartridge casings matching the one found in Cedar Ridge's livery stable. He's watching his back trail, Thunderhawk murmured. Expecting pursuit. Smart man, Reid acknowledged, but not smart enough to cover his tracks from you. They continued their cautious advance toward the cottonwood grove, moving from shadow to shadow with weapons ready. The silence was absolute. No birds called, no insects buzzed, the unnatural quiet that often precedes violence. Inside the grove, they discovered the remains of a hasty rest stop. Smoldering embers of a small fire, hastily extinguished, scattered. Grounds from freshly brewed coffee, and hoofprints showing where a horse had been tethered and then ridden out at speed. Thunderhawk crouched, touching the ashes with practiced fingers. Still warm, no more than 30 minutes ahead now, Reid scanned the horizon, squinting against the afternoon glare. The trail opens up ahead. Less cover for several miles until it reaches Thunder Butte. If we push hard, we might catch sight of him before then. As they remounted and continued their pursuit, back in Cedar Ridge, Clara Blackwood Hayes fought battles of her own. The bullet wound in her shoulder throbbed relentlessly despite Dr. Matthews's laudanum, but she refused to surrender to unconsciousness, while danger still threatened those who had protected her. You should rest, Franklin Wallace urged, seated beside her bed in Widow Hayes's best guest room, now transformed into a sick room. Sheriff Reid and Thunderhawk are more than capable of handling the shooter. Clara's face was pale but determined. And what of the others? Sebastian Rook remains in custody, but his employer is a man of considerable resources and influence. This isn't over, Mr. Wallace. No, the attorney agreed soberly, but significant progress has been made. The duplicate testimony is safely on its way to both the territorial capital and Washington, and your telegraph message has already elicited a response. The governor is dispatching federal marshals who should arrive within 2 days. This news brought a measure of relief to Clara's strained features. Then perhaps my father's work wasn't in vain after all. Widow Hayes entered with fresh bandages and a stern expression that brooked no argument. Time to change these dressings, and then you're taking more laudanum, whether you like it or not, young lady. I need to keep my wits about me, Clara protested weakly. What you need is to heal, the older woman countered, already setting about her task with brisk efficiency. You've done your part for now. Let others shoulder the burden a while. As Widow Hayes worked, Clara's thoughts drifted to Thunderhawk, riding across the plains in pursuit of her would-be killer. The memory of his intense gaze before departing, the gentle strength in his hands as he'd carried her to safety, the profound connection that had grown between them against all societal expectations. These images sustained her through the pain of her wound. He'll return, Widow Hayes remarked quietly, accurately reading her patient's thoughts. That man didn't survive battles against both his worlds to fall now. Clara managed a small smile, despite her discomfort. Is it so obvious? Only to anyone with eyes and sense, the widow replied dryly. Though half the town's already scandalized by the mere thought of it, and the other half, Widow Hayes's weathered face softened momentarily. The other half remembers that love is rare enough in this harsh land without rejecting it over foolish prejudices. She finished securing the fresh bandage with practiced hands. My first husband was half Cherokee, you know. Best man I ever had, though folks crossed the street to avoid us in those days. This revelation surprised Clara, who had always assumed the respectable widow's background matched her current standing in the community. I never knew. Not something I advertise, the older woman acknowledged. But not something I've ever regretted either. He died at Shiloh, fighting for the Union, despite how both sides had treated his people. Her voice carried the well-worn edges of an old grief. Point is, girl, life's too precious and too damn short to waste worrying what fools might think. This hard-earned wisdom resonated deeply with Clara, who had spent 14 months hiding not just her identity, but her very soul beneath the protective disguise of an unremarkable mail-order bride. The fire that had scarred her face had also, in its way, freed her from society's superficial judgments, a painful liberation, but liberation nonetheless. Out on the plains, the pursuit had entered a new phase. Thunderhawk, riding slightly ahead of Sheriff Reid, raised his hand in a signal to halt. Before them, the land rose gradually toward Thunder Butte, its distinctive profile stark against the late afternoon sky. But it was not the landmark that had caught the scout's attention. It was the distant figure of a rider, barely visible, as a moving speck against the golden grassland. There, Thunderhawk pointed, moving toward that line of hills. Reid squinted, then nodded in confirmation. He's making for the old mining camp at Copper Creek. Smart. Plenty of abandoned tunnels to hide in, and rough terrain that's hard to approach without being seen. We won't catch him before he reaches it, Thunderhawk observed, calculating distances with practiced eye, and a direct approach afterward would make us easy targets. The sheriff considered their options, absently checking his revolver as he thought, is there another way in? A back approach he might not expect? A ghost of a smile crossed Thunderhawk's face. There is, known only to my people, a hunting trail that follows a hidden ravine behind the eastern ridge. It would place us above and behind the old camp. Lead on, then, Reid directed, settling his hat more firmly as they urged their horses forward at a measured pace. No sense alerting him to our presence before we're ready. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the landscape in deepening gold and amber, the two pursuers left the main trail, angling northeast toward a seemingly featureless expanse of rolling hills. To Reid's untrained eye, there appeared to be no path at all, yet Thunderhawk navigated with unwavering confidence through shallow depressions and around rocky outcroppings. My grandfather showed me this way when I was a boy, the Lakota scout explained, as they entered a narrow defile hidden between two weathered bluffs. Before the miners came, before boundaries were drawn on paper maps by men who had never seen this land. There was no bitterness in his voice, merely statement of fact, yet Reid felt the weight of history in those simple words. The profound disconnection between the territory as it was experienced by its original inhabitants and as it was divided by distant governments. "Your grandfather taught you well," was all he said, ducking beneath a low-hanging ledge as the hidden trail wound deeper into the hills. The path gradually ascended, sometimes so narrow they were forced to dismount and lead their horses until, finally, Thunderhawk halted at what appeared to be a solid rock face covered with scrub brush. Without explanation, he moved several branches aside, revealing a narrow opening barely wide enough for a man to pass through sideways. "We continue on foot from here," he instructed. "The horses will be safe in this hollow. There's water in that seep." He indicated a tiny spring bubbling from between rocks nearby. After securing their mounts, the two men entered the passage, which opened surprisingly quickly onto a sheltered ledge overlooking the abandoned mining camp of Copper Creek. Below them, the remnants of human industry lay scattered across a small valley. Collapsed wooden structures, rusted equipment, the dark mouths of several mine shafts puncturing the hillsides, and moving deliberately through this desolate landscape was their quarry, dismounting near the largest mine entrance, unaware of the observers positioned above him. From their vantage point, they could see him clearly for the first time, a tall man with a distinctive military bearing, dressed in well-made frontier clothing that nonetheless marked him as not native to the territory. The Whitworth rifle was slung across his back, its long barrel identifying it as the weapon that had wounded Clara. "That's him," Reid whispered unnecessarily. "But something's not right. He's too calm, too methodical, almost as if he's—" "You're preparing a position," Thunderhawk finished, his keen eyes noting subtle details, the way the man checked sightlines, the careful placement of what appeared to be extra ammunition at strategic points. "He's not running. He's setting a trap." Reid frowned, processing this unexpected development. "You think he knows we're following?" "I think he's a professional who anticipated pursuit," Thunderhawk replied. "He's choosing to make his stand where he has every advantage, or believes he does." The lawman considered their options. "We could wait until dark, try to approach under cover of night." Thunderhawk shook his head. "The moon will be nearly full, and a man with his training will have prepared for that possibility. Then we need to change the rules of his game," Reid decided. "I'll work my way around to approach from the west. You stay here as overwatch. If he spots me, you'll have a clear shot from this position." The Lakota scout studied the terrain below with calculating precision. "There's better strategy. I can move closer using that tailings pile for cover. From there, I can create a distraction that will draw his attention away from the main shaft entrance. You circle behind through that collapsed section and take him. From the rear," Reid nodded his agreement, recognizing the tactical soundness of the plan. With minimal further communication, they separated, Thunderhawk sliding silently down a scree slope toward the position he'd identified, while Reid began the more circuitous route that would bring him behind their quarry. Back in Cedar Ridge, tension had settled over the town like an invisible fog. Most businesses' twilight shadows lengthened across Copper Creek as Sheriff Reid secured their prisoner with practiced efficiency. The shooter, who had identified himself only as Major James Hollister, formerly of the Confederate Army, maintained a professional silence as iron handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "You're making a significant error," Hollister finally remarked, his cultured southern accent at odds with the desolate mining camp. "I'm acting under authority that supersedes your territorial jurisdiction." Reid's weathered face remained impassive. "Shooting unarmed women doesn't fall under any authority I recognize, Major. The Blackwood woman is wanted for serious crimes." "Save it," Reid interrupted. checking the restraints one final time. "You can explain your version to the territorial judge." Thunderhawk, who had been examining the abandoned position with methodical precision, approached with Hollister's saddlebags. "Military maps," he reported, displaying several folded documents. "Recent, with army markings." This discovery gave Reid pause. He examined the maps, noting official stamps and annotations that appeared genuine. "Where did you get these, Major? These aren't available to civilians." Hollister's expression remained carefully neutral, though a flicker of satisfaction crossed his features. "As I was attempting to explain, Sheriff, I'm operating under sanction. Harrison Blackwell carries Federal Banking Commission authority to investigate fraud across territorial lines. My role is merely supportive." Reid and Thunder. Hawk exchanged meaningful glances. The mention of Blackwell, the architect of Clara's suffering, in connection with federal authority, represented a complication neither had anticipated. "Convenient arrangement," Reid observed dryly. "Banking Commission authority giving license for attempted murder." "Apprehension of a fugitive," Hollister corrected smoothly. "The woman's injuries were an unfortunate necessity when she resisted legitimate detention." Thunderhawk, who had maintained his characteristic stoicism throughout the exchange, moved with sudden fluid grace, bringing his face inches from the prisoners. "She was shot from hiding," he stated, his voice dangerously soft. "Without warning or challenge, the bullet struck her from behind." For the first time, Hollister's professional composure faltered slightly, something primal in him responding to the controlled intensity in the Lakota warrior's manner. Before he could formulate a response, Reid intervened. "We'll sort this out properly in Cedar Ridge," the sheriff declared, effectively ending the discussion. "Mount up, Major. It's a long ride back, and I'd prefer to make the first few miles before full dark." As they prepared for the return journey, Thunderhawk moved close to Reid, speaking in tones too low for their prisoner to overhear. "He's too confident. Something else is happening." Reid nodded, almost imperceptibly. "Blackwell at Fort Chamberlain changes everything. If he truly has federal credentials, then this man expects to be intercepted before we reach Cedar Ridge," Thunderhawk concluded, glancing toward the gathering darkness to the north. "We should avoid the main trails." "Agreed. Can you lead us back by another route?" The Lakota scout nodded once. "There's a path through Buffalo Valley, longer but less traveled. We'd reach town by mid-morning tomorrow." This decision made, they departed the abandoned mining camp, with Hollister securely mounted between them, the Major's hands bound before him and his horse's reins controlled by Reid. As darkness settled over the Dakota plains, they left the established trails, turning southeast toward the shallow depression known to the Lakota as Buffalo Valley. Behind them, unseen in the gathering night, dust rose on the northern horizon as riders from Fort Chamberlain moved with purpose toward Copper Creek. In Cedar Ridge, the telegraph office had become the nerve center of unfolding events. Franklin Wallace had maintained a stream of communication with Captain Lewis at Fort Chamberlain, carefully employing his legal expertise to introduce elements of doubt regarding Blackwell's authority without directly challenging it. Latest response. The telegraph operator announced, hurrying into Widow Hayes's parlor, where Wallace and Clara had established their makeshift headquarters. "From Captain Lewis." Wallace read the message with intense concentration, his expression gradually relaxing. "It's working," he told Clara, who sat propped in an armchair, her wounded shoulder carefully bandaged, but her mind fully engaged, despite Dr. Matthews' medical objections to her leaving bed. "Lewis is asking questions that Blackwell clearly finds uncomfortable." Clara reviewed the telegram, her analytical mind, so like her father's, quickly grasping the implications. "He's requesting documentation verification from Washington," she noted. "That will take days." "Precisely. Days during which Blackwell's Influence at the fort is compromised. Wallace allowed himself a small smile of professional satisfaction. Lewis appears to be a cautious man who values proper procedure. Exactly the type who would hesitate to act on authority he cannot personally verify. This tactical victory, while significant, provided only temporary advantage. Clara's scarred face reflected the weight of deeper concerns as she gazed toward the window where night had fully claimed the town. Sheriff Reid and Thunderhawk still don't know the danger, she reminded Wallace. If Blackwell sends men from the fort to intercept them, the attorney nodded gravely. I've considered that possibility. But we have one advantage. They likely don't know precisely where to look. The Dakota Territory is vast, with countless trails and approaches. Thunderhawk would never use the obvious routes, Clara agreed, drawing confidence from her knowledge of the man whose quiet strength had become her anchor in the storm of recent events. Not with a prisoner, and certainly not if he suspected potential pursuit. Their strategic assessment was interrupted by the arrival of Deputy Wilson, his young face drawn with fatigue, but his bearing more mature than his years might suggest. The events of recent days had aged him, forcing rapid growth from eager boy to determined lawman. Pembroke's asking to speak with someone, he reported. Says he has information to trade for leniency. Wallace's professional interest was immediately piqued. What kind of information? Wouldn't say specifically, just that he's realized how deeply he's been used by those Boston fellas and wants to make things right before it's too late. Clara and Wallace exchanged meaningful glances. Walter Pembroke, the man who had rejected Clara for her scars and later attempted to kill her, now potentially offered an unexpected ally against Blackwell's machinations. I'll speak with him, Wallace decided, rising from his chair. His testimony could prove valuable, particularly regarding how Blackwell's men recruited local support. As the attorney departed with Deputy Wilson, Clara found herself momentarily alone with her thoughts. The quiet of Widow Hayes's parlor, the older woman having finally succumbed to exhaustion and retired to her room, allowed reflection on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. 14 months earlier, she had been Charlotte Blackwood Hayes, privileged daughter of a Harvard professor, her world defined by Boston's rarefied intellectual circles. The fire that claimed her father and their family home had destroyed that identity, along with her unmarked beauty, forcing her transformation into Clara Blackwood, unremarkable mail-order bride seeking anonymous new beginnings in the territory. She had expected many things from her frontier exile: hardship, loneliness, perhaps eventually a kind of resigned acceptance of her diminished circumstances. What she had never anticipated was finding profound connection with a man whose world seemed impossibly distant from her own, yet whose soul spoke to hers with unexpected clarity. Her fingers rose unconsciously to touch the scarred tissue along, her cheek no longer with shame, but with something approaching acceptance. These marks had driven Walter Pembroke to reject her on sight, yet Thunderhawk had seen beyond them from their first encounter, recognizing in her something that transcended physical appearance, a kindred spirit forged by adversity into something stronger than before. Out on the moonlit plains, Thunderhawk led their small party through Buffalo Valley with unerring confidence despite the darkness. The route followed a shallow stream bed for several miles before cutting eastward across rolling grasslands punctuated by scattered cottonwood groves. He maintained a punishing pace, driven by instincts that warned of pursuit and by personal concern. For Clara that he contained beneath his customary stoic exterior. Sheriff Reid, riding alongside their prisoner, observed his guide with growing respect. Most white men, himself included, required regular bearings against known landmarks to navigate the seemingly featureless Dakota night. Thunderhawk moved with the assurance of one reading familiar text, discerning pathways invisible to others. Major Hollister, for his part, maintained calculated silence, his military training evident in his straight-backed posture despite bound hands and the discomfort of hours in the saddle. Occasionally, his gaze would drift toward the northern horizon, a subtle tell that Reid didn't miss. "Expecting company, Major?" The sheriff inquired casually during a brief halt to rest the horses. Hollister's expression revealed nothing, merely considering how quickly misunderstandings can be resolved once we reach proper authority. Proper authority being Harrison Blackwell? Thunderhawk asked, materializing silently beside them after scouting their back trail. "Mr. Blackwell represents legitimate financial interests that Miss Blackwood Hayes has maliciously defamed," Hollister replied smoothly. "Her accusations have caused considerable damage to respected institutions." "Interesting perspective," Reid commented. "Given that those respected institutions seem uncommonly interested in permanently silencing a scarred woman whose only weapon is the truth." Hollister offered no response, but his eyes remained fixed on the northern darkness with expectant patience that further convinced his captors of impending complications. In Cedar Ridge, Franklin Wallace emerged from the jail with newfound determination in his stride. His conversation with Walter Pembroke had yielded unexpected dividends, detailed information about Blackwell's operations that corroborated Clara's testimony while adding crucial local context. "Pembroke was approached 3 weeks ago," he explained to Clara upon returning to the boarding house. "A man claiming to represent Eastern investors offered substantial capital for water rights acquisition, with generous commissions for local partners who could identify vulnerable properties." Clara absorbed this information with the analytical precision that had made her father a formidable academic. "Setting groundwork for the same scheme they employed in Massachusetts," she observed. "First secure water access, then manipulate availability to force sales of dependent properties." Precisely. But what Pembroke didn't realize initially was that these investors were simultaneously investigating rumors of a scarred Boston woman recently arrived in the territory as a mail-order bride. "They were looking for me even before they confirmed my identity," Clara concluded, her scarred fingers tightening around the teacup Widow Hayes had insisted she drink despite the late hour. "Father always said Blackwell was nothing if not thorough." Wallace nodded gravely. "When your photograph was circulated and Pembroke realized the fugitive they sought was the same woman he had rejected, his wounded pride made him an easy recruit for their purposes. And now he understands he was merely a pawn in a larger game, one that involves corrupt judges, fraudulent federal credentials, and calculated violence that goes far beyond anything he imagined when nursing his injured vanity. This assessment, while hardly exonerating Pembroke, offered strategic advantage. His willingness to testify against Blackwell added another layer of verification to Clara's account, a local voice that frontier authorities might find more immediately credible than an Eastern woman's claims, regardless of supporting documentation. As midnight approached, Widow Hayes returned to the parlor, her practical nature asserting itself despite the late hour. "You need rest," she informed Clara firmly. "That shoulder won't heal if you keep pushing yourself." Clara began a token protest, but the older woman's stern expression brooked no argument. With Wallace's assistance, she returned to her sickroom, though her mind remained actively engaged with the unfolding situation despite her body's demands for recovery. "I'll maintain watch through the night," Wallace assured her. "Deputy Wilson has organized reliable townsmen to patrol the streets, and the telegraph operator has promised to bring any new messages immediately, regardless of the hour." These precautions, while sensible, did little to ease Clara's deepest concern: the safety. The first light of dawn painted the eastern horizon in delicate shades of gold and rose as Thunderhawk navigated the treacherous slopes of Devil's Backbone. He moved with the fluid efficiency of a man completely attuned to his environment, finding purchase on narrow ledges and weathered outcroppings that would have defeated less skilled travelers. His knowledge of this challenging terrain, passed down through generations of his mother's people, now served a purpose none of his ancestors could have foreseen. Wallace joined her at the window, squinting against the bright sunlight. "Alone? Where's Reid?" "I don't know," Clara admitted, already moving toward the door despite her injury. "But we'll have answers soon." Word of Thunderhawk's approach spread quickly through Cedar Ridge. By the time he reached the main street, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by curiosity, and the sense of morning sunlight streamed through the window of Cedar Ridge's modest jail, illuminating dust motes that danced in golden beams across Harrison Blackwell's immaculate suit. The Boston financier sat rigidly on the narrow cot, his aristocratic features set in an expression of cold fury that had not diminished since his arrest the previous evening. Across the small cell, his security man dozed fitfully in the corner, having resigned himself more readily to their circumstances. Deputy Wilson entered, carrying a tray with coffee and simple breakfast fare. The young lawman's demeanor had transformed noticeably over recent days. The eager boy replaced by a more measured officer who carried his responsibilities with newfound gravity. "Territorial marshals expected by noon," Wilson informed Blackwell, as he slid the tray through the cell door slot. "Federal authorities not far behind." Blackwell's response was glacial silence, though his eyes tracked the deputy with calculating intensity. Only when Wilson had departed did he speak, his cultured Boston accent incongruous in the frontier jail. "This changes nothing, Mason," he addressed his security man quietly. "Our associates remain in position." Mason stirred, revealing the professional vigilance that had merely been masked by apparent sleep. "Difficult circumstances, sir." The telegraph. "Wires are watched, and our previous local allies have proven unreliable." "Pembroke's betrayal was unexpected," Blackwell acknowledged with clinical detachment. "But redundancy has always been our operational principle. Hollister's contingency remains viable." The implication hung in the stale jail air between them, a final desperate gambit that had yet to play out in the unfolding drama. Blackwell sipped the bitter coffee without complaint, his aristocratic mannerisms preserved even in captivity, as he calculated remaining options with the same methodical precision that had built his financial empire. At Fort Chamberlain, Sheriff, Reid stood at rigid attention before Captain Lewis's desk. The confrontation between territorial and military authority having reached a critical juncture with the arrival of telegraphic confirmation from the governor's office. "These orders are explicit, Lieutenant Harding," Captain Lewis stated firmly, addressing the young officer who had led the patrol to Devil's Backbone. "Sheriff Reid is to be released from detention immediately, and Major Hollister transferred to territorial custody pending investigation of serious charges." Lieutenant Harding's discomfort was evident as he shifted between military obligation and conflicting authorities. "Sir, Mr. Blackwell assured me his Federal Banking Commission credentials were subject to verification," Lewis interrupted crisply. "Verification that has now conclusively failed. The Treasury Department has no record of his supposed commission, and the governor's office has provided compelling evidence of fraudulent documentation." Reid maintained diplomatic silence during this exchange, though satisfaction flickered briefly across his weathered features. The wheels of justice turned slowly on the frontier, but they turned inevitably when proper evidence was presented through correct channels. "Sheriff," Lewis continued, turning to Reid with professional courtesy, "I must offer formal apologies for this regrettable misunderstanding. Major Hollister will be released to your custody immediately, and transportation arranged for your return to Cedar Ridge." Reid acknowledged this with a respectful nod. "Much appreciated, Captain. I understand the difficult position Blackwell's deception created for your command." As arrangements were made for Hollister's transfer, Reid took the opportunity to send a telegram to Cedar Ridge, confirming his imminent return and requesting update on developments there. The message was brief but comprehensive, precisely the kind of efficient communication that characterized the sheriff's approach to his duties. What neither Reid nor Captain Lewis could have anticipated was that this routine telegram would trigger the final desperate countermove in Blackwell's elaborate strategy, a contingency plan established weeks earlier when the financier first received confirmation of Clara Blackwood Hayes' location. In Cedar Ridge, the morning brought cautious optimism as news of Sheriff Reid's release from Fort Chamberlain reached the town. Clara, whose shoulder wound had begun healing sufficiently to permit greater movement, sat with Franklin Wallace and Thunderhawk in Widow Hayes' parlor, reviewing the latest developments. The territorial marshal should arrive by noon, Wallace reported with professional satisfaction, with formal authorization to transport both Blackwell and his associate to the capital for arraignment. Federal investigators are expected within days to begin documenting the broader conspiracy. Clara absorbed this information with measured relief. So the immediate danger has passed. Thunderhawk, who had maintained his characteristic vigilance despite the apparent resolution, shook his head slightly. Blackwell is cornered, most dangerous time. This assessment aligned with Clara's own knowledge of the financier's methods, gleaned from her father's investigations. "You're right," she acknowledged. "Father always said Blackwell maintained contingency plans beyond what seemed reasonable, redundancies upon redundancies. Precisely why I've arranged continued protection," Wallace confirmed, nodding toward the window where several local ranchers maintained casual but obvious watch over the boarding house. "Deputy Wilson has organized rotation schedules until the marshal arrives." The attorney's meticulous attention to security details provided some reassurance, yet Clara could not entirely dismiss the lingering unease that crept along her nerves like winter frost. Blackwell had pursued her too methodically, for too long, to surrender without exhausting every possible avenue of attack. Her concern proved prescient when Rebecca West, the schoolteacher, arrived with unsettling news gleaned from her morning class. "2 children absent today," she reported after accepting Widow Hayes' offered coffee. "The Harper twins. Their mother sent word they're ill, but Jimmy Fletcher swears he saw them riding with a stranger at dawn, headed north along the creek. Road." Thunderhawk's expression sharpened with immediate focus. Description of the stranger. "Tall man, city clothes, spoke with an accent," Rebecca replied, her concern growing as she registered the other's reactions. The Fletcher boy thought nothing of it, assumed it was a relative visiting, or Hollister's previously unidentified associate, Wallace concluded grimly, the 4th man in Blackwell's local operation. Thunderhawk was already moving toward the door, his decision made without need for discussion. "I'll track them," he stated simply. Clara rose immediately, her face set with determination that brooked no argument. Not alone. A complex exchange passed between them, concern, protest, and resolution communicated without words in the brief meeting of their eyes. Thunderhawk recognized the futility of attempting to dissuade her, just as Clara acknowledged the very real dangers they might face. "The Harper farm is 3 miles north," Rebecca offered, understanding immediately the urgency of the situation. "The creek road runs behind their property before continuing toward the old trading post." Wallace's legal mind calculated implications swiftly. "A hostage scenario," he concluded. "Leverage to force your silence or secure Blackwell's release. Or simple revenge," Clara added quietly, knowing the financier's capacity for calculated cruelty when his ambitions were thwarted. "Either way, those children must be our priority." Preparations were made with efficient haste. Thunderhawk secured horses while Clara changed into more practical riding attire, her wounded shoulder still tender but sufficiently healed for necessary movement. Wallace dispatched messages to both Deputy Wilson and the approaching Territorial Marshal, alerting them to this new development without creating public panic that might endanger the Harper children. Within 30 minutes, Clara and Thunderhawk departed Cedar Ridge, following the creek road northward at a pace balanced between urgency and the caution required for effective tracking. Behind them, Wallace organized a secondary response, a small group of armed townsmen who would follow at a distance, providing backup without potentially triggering hasty action from the kidnapper. The midsummer sun climbed higher as they rode, its heat intensifying across the rolling Dakota landscape. Thunderhawk read the trail with practiced expertise, identifying signs invisible to untrained eyes. A child's footprint here, evidence of 3 horses traveling together there, vegetation, disturbed in patterns that told a clear story to one fluent in nature's language. Headed toward the old trading post, he confirmed, after examining tracks at a small creek crossing. 3 horses, 2 children and a man, children riding double on one mount. Clara absorbed this information with the analytical precision that had characterized her father's academic approach. The trading post has been abandoned since spring, she noted, recalling details from her months in Cedar Ridge. Isolated, defensible position with clear views of approaching riders. Behind him, the sound of distant voices carried on the still morning air, Sheriff Reid engaging with the military patrol that had tracked them to the defensible position where he remained with their prisoner. Thunderhawk paused briefly, listening, to determine whether the encounter had turned hostile, but the measured cadence of formal parley reassured him that immediate violence had been averted. With renewed urgency, he continued his solitary journey towards Cedar Ridge. The route he had chosen would bypass the main trails entirely, cutting across terrain considered impassable by most settlers. If his calculations proved correct, he could reach town by early afternoon, hours before any military patrol could return, even if they departed immediately with Sheriff Reid and Hollister in custody. Back on Devil's Backbone, Thomas Reid maintained the calm authority that had served him well through 15 years as a frontier lawman. Before him, arranged in a loose semicircle, sat mounted soldiers from Fort Chamberlain, led by a young lieutenant whose expression conveyed determined purpose, tempered by uncertainty. "I appreciate your position, Lieutenant Harding," Reid acknowledged, keeping his voice measured and reasonable. "But I'm afraid I cannot surrender a prisoner lawfully detained for attempted murder without proper documentation." The lieutenant shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Sir, I have orders directly from Mr. Blackwell, who carries Federal Banking Commission authority. The paperwork should be presented to a territorial judge," Reid interrupted firmly, "not enforced at gunpoint in the wilderness. If Mr. Blackwell's credentials are legitimate, he has nothing to fear from proper legal channels." Major Hollister, still secured beside Reid, maintained calculated silence during this exchange, though his expression betrayed growing frustration with the lieutenant's inability to resolve the situation promptly. "Sheriff," the young officer tried again, "my orders are explicit. I'm to return with both Major Hollister and yourself to Fort Chamberlain, where the jurisdiction question can be properly addressed." Reid's weathered face revealed nothing of the strategic calculations occurring behind his impassive exterior. The standoff presented complex considerations. Refusing would likely provoke armed confrontation against superior numbers, while complying would place him under Blackwell's influence at the fort, potentially delaying justice indefinitely. His decision was guided by 2 certainties. Thunderhawk was already well on his way to Cedar Ridge with news of their situation, and Captain Lewis had demonstrated skepticism regarding Blackwell's authority. These factors suggested a diplomatic approach might best serve their ultimate goal. "Very well, Lieutenant," Reid finally conceded. "I'll accompany you to Fort Chamberlain to discuss the matter with Captain Lewis. but I do so under protest and with the understanding that I retain custody of my prisoner until proper legal documentation is presented." The young officer visibly relaxed at this compromise, clearly relieved to avoid potential bloodshed. "That's reasonable, Sheriff. We'll depart immediately." As the combined party prepared to leave Devil's Backbone, Reid glanced eastward toward Cedar Ridge, calculating how much time Thunderhawk would need to reach town and set counteractions in motion. The delay tactics he intended to employ during their journey to the fort would provide additional hours that might prove crucial in the unfolding conflict between frontier justice and corrupt Eastern influence. In Cedar Ridge, Clara awoke to bright morning sunshine streaming through her window. Despite Dr. Matthews' stern instructions to remain abed, she carefully rose and dressed, wincing as the movement pulled at her wounded shoulder. The previous day's exertions had taken their toll, leaving her weaker than she cared to admit. But determination drove her forward nonetheless. She found Franklin Wallace in Widow Hayes's parlor, papers spread across the table and a cup of coffee cooling beside him. The attorney looked up at her entrance, his expression suggesting both concern for her health and excitement regarding developments. "Captain Lewis has formally refused Blackwell's request for additional military support," Wallace announced triumphantly. "The telegraph arrived an hour ago." Lewis cited procedural irregularities and pending verification from Washington as justification. Clara absorbed this significant news with measured optimism that limits Blackwell's options considerably. Indeed, and there's more, Pembroke has formally signed his statement regarding Blackwell's recruitment of local support. Deputy Wilson is collecting corroborating accounts from 2 other ranchers who were similarly approached. This systematic dismantling of Blackwell's legal position represented substantial progress. Clara allowed herself a moment of vindication. Her father would have appreciated the elegant manner in which truth was gradually overcoming deception through proper channels and documentation. "Any word of Sheriff Reid and Thunderhawk?" she asked, her tone carefully controlled, despite the concern that had plagued her throughout the restless night. Wallace shook his head regretfully. "Nothing yet. But that's not unexpected given the distances involved." Widow Hayes entered with a tray bearing breakfast and fresh coffee, her practical nature asserting itself amid legal and strategic concerns. "You'll do no one any good by collapsing from hunger," she informed Clara firmly, "especially not that Indian of yours when he returns." The casual ownership implied in the phrase, "that Indian of yours," might have seemed presumptuous from anyone else, but Clara recognized the older woman's acceptance embedded within the blunt frontier phrasing. In Widow Hayes's pragmatic worldview, the connection between Clara and Thunderhawk was simply a fact to be acknowledged rather than questioned. As Clara obediently accepted the offered breakfast, the parlor door burst open to admit the telegraph operator, his face flushed with excitement and a yellow paper clutched in his hand. "Urgent message from Fort Chamberlain," he announced breathlessly. "From Captain Lewis himself." Wallace quickly took the telegram, scanning its contents with the practiced efficiency of a legal mind accustomed to extracting key information from dense text. His expression darkened progressively. "Blackwell has dispatched Lieutenant Harding's patrol to intercept Sheriff Reid," he reported grimly, "before Lewis's countermanding order could reach them. The captain fears they may attempt to bring both Reid and their suspect to the fort under questionable authority." Clara's face paled beneath her scars. "Can Lewis prevent this?" "He's trying," Wallace replied, indicating the telegram. "He's explicitly ordering Harding to await proper documentation before taking any action. But if they've already located Reid, the implications hung heavily in the air. Sheriff Reid might already be under effective military detention, while Thunderhawk, if he'd managed to avoid capture, would be their only source of information regarding the situation. We need to prepare for all possibilities," Clara decided, her analytical mind pushing through emotional concerns to focus on practical strategy. If Sheriff Reid is brought to Fort Chamberlain under Blackwell's influence, what legal recourse exists? Wallace considered carefully. Captain Lewis appears to be our ally in this matter. His insistence on proper procedure provides leverage, and the governor's office has acknowledged receipt of your testimony. Their response could arrive any moment. Their strategic discussion continued through the morning, interrupted periodically by updates from Deputy Wilson regarding town security, and additional telegrams documenting the increasingly tense standoff developing at Fort Chamberlain between Captain Lewis and Harrison Blackwell. Shortly after noon, as Clara stood by the parlor window, gazing westward with carefully concealed anxiety, a flicker of movement on the distant plain caught her attention. A single rider approached at a punishing pace, the distinctive silhouette immediately recognizable despite the distance. "Thunderhawk," she whispered, relief flooding through her so intensely that she gripped the windowsill for support. "He's coming!" Wallace joined her at the window, squinting against the bright sunlight. "Alone? Where's Reid?" "I don't know," Clara admitted, already moving toward the door despite her injury. "But we'll have answers soon." Word of Thunderhawk's approach spread quickly through Cedar Ridge. By the time he reached the main street, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by curiosity, and the sense of morning sunlight streamed through the window of Cedar Ridge's modest jail, illuminating dust motes that danced in golden beams across Harrison Blackwell's immaculate suit. The Boston financier sat rigidly on the narrow cot, his aristocratic features set in an expression of cold fury that had not diminished since his arrest the previous evening. Across the small cell, his security man dozed fitfully in the corner. Having resigned himself more readily to their circumstances, Deputy Wilson entered, carrying a tray with coffee and simple breakfast fare. The young lawman's demeanor had transformed noticeably over recent days, the eager boy replaced by a more measured officer who carried his responsibilities with newfound gravity. "Territorial marshals expected by noon," Wilson informed Blackwell, as he slid the tray through the cell door slot. "Federal authorities not far behind." Blackwell's response was glacial silence, though his eyes tracked the deputy with calculating intensity. Only when Wilson had departed did he speak, his cultured Boston accent incongruous in the frontier jail. "This changes nothing, Mason," he addressed his security man quietly. "Our associates remain in position." Mason stirred, revealing the professional vigilance that had merely been masked by apparent sleep. "Difficult circumstances, sir. The telegraph. Wires are watched, and our previous local allies have proven unreliable." "Pembroke's betrayal was unexpected," Blackwell acknowledged with clinical detachment. "But redundancy has always been our operational principle. Hollister's contingency remains viable." The implication hung in the stale jail air between them, a final desperate gambit that had yet to play out in the unfolding drama. Blackwell sipped the bitter coffee without complaint, his aristocratic mannerisms preserved even in captivity, as he calculated remaining options with the same methodical precision that had built his financial empire. At Fort Chamberlain, Sheriff Reid stood at rigid attention before Captain Lewis's desk, the confrontation between territorial and military authority having reached a critical juncture with the arrival of telegraphic confirmation from the governor's office. "These orders are explicit, Lieutenant Harding," Captain Lewis stated firmly, addressing the young officer who had led the patrol to Devil's Backbone. "Sheriff Reid is to be released from detention immediately, and Major Hollister transferred to territorial custody pending investigation of serious charges." Lieutenant Harding's discomfort was evident as he shifted between military obligation and conflicting authorities. "Sir, Mr. Blackwell assured me his Federal Banking Commission credentials were subject to verification," Lewis interrupted crisply. "Verification that has now conclusively failed. The Treasury Department has no record of his supposed commission, and the governor's office has provided compelling evidence of fraudulent documentation. Reid maintained diplomatic silence during this exchange, though satisfaction flickered briefly across his weathered features. The wheels of justice turned slowly on the frontier, but they turned inevitably when proper evidence was presented through correct channels. "Sheriff," Lewis continued, turning to Reid with professional courtesy, "I must offer formal apologies for this regrettable misunderstanding. Major Hollister will be released to your custody immediately and transportation arranged for your return to Cedar Ridge." Reid acknowledged this with a respectful nod. "Much appreciated, Captain. I understand the difficult position Blackwell's deception created for your command." As arrangements were made for Hollister's transfer, Reid took the opportunity to send a telegram to Cedar Ridge, confirming his imminent return and requesting update on developments there. The message was brief but comprehensive, precisely the kind of efficient communication that characterized the sheriff's approach to his duties. What neither Reid nor Captain Lewis could have anticipated was that this routine telegram would trigger the final desperate countermove in Blackwell's elaborate strategy, a contingency plan established weeks earlier when the financier first received confirmation of Clara Blackwood Hayes' location. In Cedar Ridge, the morning brought cautious optimism as news of Sheriff Reid's release from Fort Chamberlain reached the town. Clara, whose shoulder wound had begun healing sufficiently to permit greater movement, sat with Franklin Wallace and Thunderhawk in Widow Hayes' parlor, reviewing the latest developments. "The territorial marshal should arrive by noon," Wallace reported with professional satisfaction, "with formal authorization to transport both Blackwell and his associate to the capital for arraignment. Federal investigators are expected within days to begin documenting the broader conspiracy." Clara absorbed this information with measured relief. "So the immediate danger has passed." Thunderhawk, who had maintained his characteristic vigilance despite the apparent resolution, shook his head slightly. "Blackwell is cornered, most dangerous time." This assessment aligned with Clara's own knowledge of the financier's methods, gleaned from her father's investigations. "You're right," she acknowledged. "Father always said Blackwell maintained contingency plans beyond what seemed reasonable, redundancies upon redundancies. Precisely why I've arranged continued protection," Wallace confirmed, nodding toward the window where several local ranchers maintained casual but obvious watch over the boarding house. "Deputy Wilson has organized rotation schedules until the Guy Marshal arrives." The attorney's meticulous attention to security details provided some reassurance, yet Clara could not entirely dismiss the lingering unease that crept along her nerves like winter frost. Blackwell had pursued her too methodically, for too long, to surrender without exhausting every possible avenue of attack. Her concern proved prescient when Rebecca West, the schoolteacher, arrived with unsettling news gleaned from her morning class. "2 children absent today," she reported after accepting Widow Hayes' offered coffee. "The Harper twins. Their mother sent word they're ill, but Jimmy Fletcher swears he saw them riding with a stranger at dawn, headed north along the creek road." Thunderhawk's expression sharpened with immediate focus. "Description of the stranger." "Tall man, city clothes, spoke with an accent," Rebecca replied, her concern growing as she registered the others' reactions. The Fletcher boy thought nothing of it, assumed it was a relative visiting, or Hollister's previously unidentified associate, Wallace concluded grimly, the 4th man in Blackwell's local operation. Thunderhawk was already moving toward the door, his decision made without need for discussion. "I'll track them," he stated simply. Clara rose immediately, her face set with determination that brooked no argument. Not alone. A complex exchange passed between them. Concern, protest, and resolution communicated without words in the brief meeting of their eyes. Thunderhawk recognized the futility of attempting to dissuade her, just as Clara acknowledged the very real dangers they might face. "The Harper farm is 3 miles north," Rebecca offered, understanding immediately the urgency of the situation. "The creek road runs behind their property before continuing toward the old trading post." Wallace's legal mind calculated implications swiftly. "A hostage scenario," he concluded, "leveraged to force your silence or secure Blackwell's release." "Or simple revenge," Clara added quietly, knowing the financier's capacity for calculated cruelty when his ambitions were thwarted. "Either way, those children must be our priority." Preparations were made with efficient haste. Thunderhawk secured horses, while Clara changed into more practical riding attire, her wounded shoulder still tender, but sufficiently healed for necessary movement. Wallace dispatched messages to both Deputy Wilson and the approaching Territorial Marshal, alerting them to this new development without creating public panic that might endanger the Harper children. Within 30 minutes, Clara and Thunderhawk departed Cedar Ridge, following the creek road northward at a pace balanced between urgency and the caution required for effective tracking. Behind them, Wallace organized a secondary response, a small group of armed townsmen who would follow at a distance, providing backup without potentially triggering hasty action from the kidnapper. The midsummer sun climbed higher as they rode, its heat intensifying across the rolling Dakota landscape. Thunderhawk read the trail with practiced expertise, identifying signs invisible to untrained eyes. A child's footprint here, evidence of 3 horses traveling together there, vegetation, disturbed in patterns that told a clear story to one fluent in nature's language. "Headed toward the old trading post," he confirmed, after examining tracks at a small creek crossing. 3 horses, 2 children and a man, children riding double on one mount. Clara absorbed this information with the analytical precision that had characterized her father's academic approach. "The trading post has been abandoned since spring," she noted, recalling details from her months in Cedar Ridge. "Isolated, defensible position with clear views of approaching riders." Thunderhawk nodded once, appreciating her tactical assessment. "Likely chose it deliberately, military background like Hollister." This connection strengthened the probability that they faced another of Blackwell's professional operatives, someone with training and experience that made him significantly more dangerous than local hired help might have been. The stakes clarified with each mile they traveled, innocent children held by a desperate man executing the final gambit of a cornered mastermind. As they approached the final ridge before the trading post would come into view, Thunderhawk signaled for them to dismount and proceed with greater caution. He secured their horses in a small copse of cottonwoods, then led Clara along a subtle depression that provided concealment as they advanced. From their vantage point atop the ridge, the abandoned trading post lay exposed in the midday sun, a weathered wooden structure with adjoining stable, positioned near the creek that had once made it a natural stopping point for travelers. A single horse was tethered outside, confirming occupation. Through careful observation, they identified movement within, occasional shadows passing the building's grimy windows, suggesting the children were being kept inside rather than in the more vulnerable, stable area. One man, Thunderhawk assessed, noting details Clara might have missed, moving between front room and back storage area, rifle visible. Clara studied the layout, calculating approaches and vulnerabilities. "The creek side has fewer windows," she observed, possible blind approach from that direction. Her tactical thinking earned a glance of approval from Thunderhawk, further evidence of how their different backgrounds had forged complementary strengths. Where most Eastern women of her education might have faltered in such circumstances, Clara applied her analytical mind to practical survival considerations with remarkable adaptation. "I'll circle around," Thunderhawk decided after completing his assessment. "Approach from creekside. When I'm in position, you'll create distraction from this ridge. Clara understood immediately. Draw his attention outward while you enter. From behind, the strategy was sound but carried obvious risks. After confirming details and establishing signals, they prepared to separate Thunderhawk, beginning his circuitous approach while Clara remained on the ridge to observe and time her distraction precisely. Before departing, Thunderhawk paused, his typically stoic expression revealing momentary depth of feeling that 3 weeks after Harrison Blackwell's arrest, Cedar Ridge had settled into an uneasy normalcy. The late summer sun blazed across the main street, merchants conducted business with customary frontier efficiency, and the saloon maintained its status as social nexus for working men seeking respite from daily labors. Yet beneath this routine, subtle transformations had altered the community's dynamics permanently. Clara Blackwood Hayes, no longer hiding behind her mail-order bride identity, had become an unexpected fixture in town life. Her wounded shoulder had healed sufficiently to permit most normal activities, though Dr. Matthews still insisted on periodic examinations that she endured with characteristic grace. More significant than her physical recovery was her integration into Cedar Ridge's social fabric. No longer an object of whispered speculation, but a respected community member whose courage had earned genuine acceptance. At Widow Hayes's boarding house, Clara sat reviewing correspondence that had accumulated since the dramatic events of recent weeks. Letters from her father's former colleagues at Harvard expressed both condolences for her ordeals and admiration for her persistence in bringing Blackwell's crimes to light. The territorial governor had formalized his offer of a teaching position at the capital's newly established academy, pending resolution of legal proceedings requiring her testimony. Most consequential was a thick envelope bearing the seal of the Federal Marshal's Office, official notification that Blackwell and his associates had been transferred to federal custody and transported east for trial on multiple charges spanning several jurisdictions. The documentation included a formal deposition schedule requiring Clara's presence in Washington within 2 months. "They're not wasting time," Franklin Wallace observed from his position by the window. The Boston attorney had extended his stay in Cedar Ridge to coordinate legal matters, though his primary motivation, clear to observers with discerning eyes, involved ensuring Clara's interests remained properly protected. "Father would appreciate the thoroughness," Clara replied, her scarred fingers tracing the embossed federal seal. "Though I imagine Blackwell has already engaged Boston's finest legal minds to construct his defense." Difficult to defend against. "Documentation this comprehensive," Wallace noted with professional satisfaction. "The financial records you salvaged from the fire, combined with Pembroke's testimony and Major Hollister's subsequent cooperation, create a compelling case." Clara nodded thoughtfully, though her expression suggested her mind had partially drifted elsewhere. In recent days, this periodic distraction had become noticeable to those who knew her well. Moments when her analytical focus yielded to more personal considerations that she had long subordinated to survival necessities. The source of her preoccupation was no mystery to those closest to her situation. Thunderhawk had departed Cedar Ridge 5 days earlier, summoned to Fort Chamberlain by Captain Lewis for consultation regarding Lakota movements along the territory's western borders. Though his duties as scout had frequently required such absences in the past, this separation carried different significance given the relationship that had developed between him and Clara during their shared ordeal. "Any word from the fort?" Wallace inquired with careful neutrality, recognizing Clara's unspoken concern despite her composed exterior. "A brief telegraph yesterday," she acknowledged. "Military matters have complicated the situation. Hawk expects to remain there at least another week." The attorney studied her with thoughtful assessment, noting the subtle indicators of internal conflict beneath her cultivated poise. "You're considering the governor's offer?" Among other possibilities, Clara admitted, unconsciously touching the scarred tissue along her cheek, a gesture that had evolved from self-conscious concealment to thoughtful habit. The academy position offers security and purpose. Yet, her unfinished thought hung between them, encompassing considerations too complex for casual articulation. Wallace, whose professional career had attuned him to unspoken subtexts, recognized the fundamental dilemma she faced: personal inclinations potentially diverging from practical opportunities and societal expectations. Territorial capitals offer certain advantages, he observed diplomatically: cultural amenities, intellectual society, legal protections, elements perhaps more familiar to your Boston background. Clara smiled faintly, appreciating both his insight and his delicacy. While placing me firmly within structured society again, the same society that determines which scars are acceptable and which relationships are permissible. This candid assessment, the most direct reference she had made to her developing connection with Thunderhawk, momentarily surprised Wallace, despite his professional composure. Before he could formulate response, their conversation was interrupted by Rebecca West's arrival, the schoolteacher's expression conveying news of significance. "Rider coming from the northwest," Rebecca announced without preamble. "Moving fast." Town's already buzzing with speculation. Clara's reaction, a subtle straightening, a momentary brightening of expression quickly modulated into cautious neutrality, revealed her immediate thought, though she voiced a more measured response. "From Fort Chamberlain's direction." "Can't be certain yet," Rebecca replied, though her knowing glance suggested she recognized Clara's underlying hope. "Sheriff Reid has gone to meet them." The three moved to Widow Hayes's front porch, joining other curious residents gathering along Cedar Ridge's main street as the approaching rider became visible in the distance. Clara maintained carefully cultivated dignity, despite the eager anticipation she couldn't entirely conceal from those who had come to know her well. As the rider drew closer, even dust-obscured details confirmed it was not Thunderhawk returning unexpectedly from Fort Chamberlain. The figure's military posture and uniform became apparent, identifying him as an army courier rather than the Lakota scout, whose absence had left an unacknowledged void in Clara's carefully reconstructed daily routines. Sheriff Reid intercepted the courier at the edge of town, engaged in brief conversation, then directed him toward the boarding house with uncharacteristic urgency. This departure from Reid's typically measured approach triggered renewed speculation among onlookers already primed for excitement after weeks of relative calm. "Miss Blackwood Hayes?" the courier inquired upon reaching the porch, formally saluting despite his road-weary appearance. "Captain Lewis sends this with highest priority." He extended a sealed dispatch bearing official Fort Chamberlain markings. Clara accepted it with outward composure that masked internal apprehension. Official military communications rarely brought welcome news, particularly when delivered with such evident urgency. Breaking the seal with steady hands that belied her concern, she scanned the contents while Wallace and Rebecca observed with poorly concealed curiosity. Her expression shifted subtly as she read, initial apprehension yielding to something more complex that even those who knew her well found difficult to interpret. "Is everything all right?" Rebecca finally ventured when Clara remained silent. The document lowered to her side as she gazed thoughtfully toward the distant horizon. "Captain Lewis reports significant developments," Clara responded, her tone carefully measured. "Northern Lakota bands have requested peace talks at Fort Chamberlain. Thunderhawk has been asked to serve as primary interpreter, given his unique position between both worlds." Wallace's legal mind immediately grasped implications beyond the surface information. This could delay his return considerably. "Yes," Clara acknowledged, her scarred fingers unconsciously tightening around the dispatch. More significantly, the territorial governor has requested my presence at the capital immediately, rather than waiting for the previously established schedule. Federal authorities have accelerated proceedings against Blackwell. This convergence of obligations pulling in different directions, Thunderhawk committed indefinitely at Fort Chamberlain while Clara was summoned to the territorial capital, created the precise dilemma she had been contemplating in less immediate terms. Theoretical considerations had suddenly manifested as practical decisions requiring resolution within days rather than the weeks or months she had anticipated. "When will you depart?" Rebecca asked quietly. Recognizing the significance of the moment, Clara squared her shoulders with the quiet dignity that had characterized her response to challenges throughout her ordeal. "The next eastbound stage leaves tomorrow morning. I should be prepared." Her decision, delivered with characteristic composure, nonetheless generated immediate ripples through Cedar Ridge's attentive community. By mid-afternoon, Widow Hayes had organized an impromptu gathering for that evening, ostensibly a simple farewell, but understood by all as acknowledgement of Clara's transformation from suspicious outsider to respected community member during her tumultuous months among them. As Clara packed her modest belongings in the boarding house room that had sheltered her through extraordinary circumstances, she found herself lingering over unexpected mementos of her time in Cedar Ridge. The simple calico dress she had worn as the mail-order bride rejected for her appearance. The leather-bound journal that had documented her gradual emergence from hiding. Small gifts from townspeople following her role in the Harper Children's Rescue. Most poignant was a small carved wooden hawk that had appeared on her windowsill the morning after Thunderhawk's departure for Fort Chamberlain, left without comment or explanation, yet eloquent in its simple representation of connection that transcended physical presence. She held it now between scarred fingers, its smooth surfaces reflecting careful craftsmanship that revealed dimensions of the maker beyond his public persona. "He has remarkable hands," Widow Hayes observed from the doorway, her practical nature never preventing accurate emotional observation. For fighting and for creating, rare combination. Clara didn't pretend to misunderstand the reference. "Yes," she agreed simply, carefully wrapping the carving in soft cloth before placing it in her traveling case. "You're really leaving, then?" the widow stated rather than asked, her tone suggesting neither judgment nor approval, but simple acknowledgement of reality. "The governor's summons leaves little choice," Clara replied, her academic precision with language revealing her upbringing despite months in frontier society. "And federal authorities require my testimony." Widow Hayes studied her with the penetrating gaze that had intimidated generations of boarders. "There's always choice, girl. Just depends what you're willing to sacrifice for it." This blunt frontier wisdom struck directly at the core of Clara's internal conflict. Duty and opportunity balanced against developing personal inclinations that contradicted societal expectations. Her father had raised her to value justice and truth above personal considerations. Her experiences since his death had taught her the complexity of human connections that transcended conventional boundaries. "I've written to Thunderhawk explaining the circumstances," she said after thoughtful pause. "Left it with Sheriff Reid to forward to Fort Chamberlain." The widow's weathered face softened slightly. "Words on paper are poor substitutes for what needs saying between two people who've faced death together." This assessment, delivered with typical frontier directness, crystallized Clara's growing discomfort with her imminent departure. The practical necessities were undeniable: legal obligations, professional opportunities, societal expectations, yet they conflicted with emerging personal truths she had only begun to acknowledge even to herself. Evening brought Cedar Ridge's residents to Widow Hayes's boarding house in surprising numbers. The farewell gathering exceeded expectations, revealing how thoroughly Clara had integrated into the community that had initially viewed her with suspicion and judgment. Walter Pembroke was conspicuously absent, having departed for his ranch immediately after providing formal testimony against Blackwell, but his former supporters had largely reconciled themselves to Clara's place among them. "You'll always have friends here," Rebecca West assured her as they stood together observing the crowded parlor. "Whatever path you choose." Clara acknowledged this with genuine appreciation, though her thoughts repeatedly drifted toward the northwestern horizon and Fort Chamberlain beyond. The evening progressed with frontier sincerity, lacking Boston's social sophistication, but offering authentic connections that compensated for absent refinements. As the gathering gradually dispersed, Sheriff Reid approached Clara with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Got something for you," he announced, producing a folded paper from his vest pocket. "Came by military courier just after sundown from Fort Chamberlain." Clara accepted the message with carefully controlled eagerness that nevertheless registered clearly to observant eyes. Moving to relative privacy by the parlor window, she unfolded Thunderhawk's response to her letter. Brief by necessity, given military courier constraints, yet conveying essential meaning with characteristic economy. "Peace talks proceeding slowly," he had written in the precise hand that always surprised those who underestimated his education. "Will conclude obligations here as soon as possible. The hawk flies where it must, but remembers where true connections lie." The metaphorical reference, obvious to anyone familiar with Lakota expressive traditions, confirmed what Clara had sensed but not allowed herself to fully acknowledge. Their connection transcended circumstances that had brought them together, becoming something neither had anticipated, yet both now recognized as significant beyond temporary alliance against common enemies. Morning arrived with the clarity characteristic of late Dakota summers, horizons sharply defined against brilliant blue skies as Clara completed final preparations for departure. The eastbound stage would arrive within the hour, beginning her journey toward the territorial capital and eventual testimony in Washington. Widow Hayes supervised breakfast with gruff efficiency that barely masked genuine concern for her departing. "Order, you'll write?" the older woman instructed rather than requested. "Let us know how you're faring among all those government officials." Clara smiled with genuine affection. "Of course. And you'll forward any messages that might arrive from Fort Chamberlain," Widow Hayes completed with knowing glance. "Already arranged with the telegraph operator. Nothing will get lost." Their farewell was interrupted by unexpected commotion outside, horses approaching at speed rather than the scheduled stagecoach. Clara moved to the window with instinctive wariness born of recent experiences, then froze momentarily as recognition registered. Thunderhawk dismounted before the boarding house with fluid grace that belied signs of hard riding, his expression containing uncharacteristic urgency as he scanned the building's facade. When Clara appeared on the porch, something passed between them that transcended conventional greeting, recognition and connection requiring no immediate words as they regarded each other across the short distance. Thunderhawk approached with measured strides, his typically stoic features revealing subtle indicators of both fatigue and determination. "You're supposed to be at Fort Thunderhawk," and Clara's eyes met, conveying everything words couldn't express. His journey through the night, her delayed departure, both testament to what they'd discovered together. "Some see scars," he said, touching her cheek gently. "I see courage." Clara smiled, knowing her choice was already made. The academy could wait. Her heart couldn't. "I'm staying," she whispered. In Cedar Ridge, a Boston professor's daughter and a Lakota warrior began writing their own legend, one that proved true beauty emerges when we're seen with loving eyes. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more tales that reveal beauty beneath scars and love beyond boundaries. New stories every week.